and welcome to today's webinar, Are You Ready? Checklist for 10-1 CMS Changes presented by QRM. My name is Amy and I'll be your moderator for this session today. Before we dive in, I'd like to introduce you to QRM. We're an in-house rehab management company that works with skilled nursing facilities across the country. We specialize in a wide range of services, including MDS education and training, medical review, compliance assistance, and marketing services. Visit QRMhealth.com to discover more about QRM and its services. So now I will pass it off to Mark Hyder, VP of Reimbursement Strategy and Education for QRM, who will introduce today's speakers.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Really happy to have all of you back with us. We know it's very important information, and this really is kind of the end of a 6-month journey for a lot of us. So with me today, I have 2 special guests and, quite frankly, 2 of my favorite colleagues, because they're such knowledgeable nurses and teachers and trainers, and I really respect the work that they do. First is Megan Usry. She is our Director of Reimbursement Programming. And Megan is a talented teacher and trainer, like I said. She really has helped develop our reimbursement department, has done a lot of work with a lot of our clients, so many of you may know her. But great to have Megan on today. The other is Stacy Grondel. Stacy is a master teacher with APAC, very skilled, knowledgeable MDS nurse as well, teacher, trainer, mentor, does a lot of things really well, and you've probably heard her on some of our other webinars. In fact, Megan and Stacy have done quite a few webinars together, individually, with me. Also, they participate in a lot of the podcasts that we do here at QRM, which are nice little tidbits of information. Easier to listen to, great format. But welcome, Megan and Stacy. Really excited to be presenting with you again today.
Thanks for having us, Mark. We're excited to be here. Yep, excited to be here. Back again.
Back again. And you know, it's funny because everybody's so nervous for this change, and I share that feeling with them. I share the anxiety that happens when it comes to changes, but I think we're in a good position, especially with the information that we've presented and a lot of what we're seeing out in the field. So I hope people walk away from this with some things to do, some things that they're doing well and they're proud of, maybe a couple other things that they feel like they've got to tweak on or before 10-1. So we're going to get started with going right to the agenda.
And I think, Mark, while we're advancing to the agenda, one thing that we really want you guys to get out of this presentation today is, what are my actionable items? What else do I need to do to make sure that these things are operationalized so that we're good to go? We know we've spent the last 6 months learning about all these changes. What are my final things that I need to check to make sure are in place? And I think that's one thing a lot of people have been yearning for. So we hope that this provides that for you.
Absolutely. So, you know, it's funny because having worked in skilled nursing facilities for years and years and years, I know all of you on this call have checklists, have to-do lists, have those things that you do every single day. So this is just another step towards that. So today we're going to be talking about first things first. We're going to be talking about our sources. Love to talk about source material. We're going to talk about interviews and look back periods. Some of those have changed. Some of those have been expanded, clarified. We're going to talk about the pay for performance programs with CMS. We're going to talk about OSAs briefly. They're important to a lot of people still. Then we're going to do a little bit of a review for Section G and GG. Now, I know, you know, Section GG is one of those topics that everybody's still talking about, because you're either switching from using G and GG in your state with Medicaid, or you're remaining G and GG for Medicaid. There's so much going on and so many questions. So hopefully we'll answer some of those today, and we'll get you thinking about your process. We'll talk about the functional outcome scores, and then we'll really talk about who does what by when. And we'll wrap it up. So let's keep moving through. Let's talk about first things first. The next slide. Here's what I want you to hear, and I wish the word care was bigger. I wish it was bigger. But one of the things I want you to think about, our primary role is always to provide the proper level of care to our residents. And this translates over into our quality measures. It translates over into our reimbursement. So, that assessment, that initial assessment, or that care plan, the care that we provide, that's the most critical thing that we need to consider. So even as we're moving towards 10-1 and we have all these process changes and we have all the information collection changes and we have some field changes on the MDS, we really need to consider the care. And the one thing that I love about the MDS role is this is a group of people who allows the facility to remain open so that care can continue. We have to get reimbursed. So I always want you to think of the care first. I really want you to think about documentation. How does that care flow over into our documentation? And if you were reviewing your own documentation as an auditor or as a surveyor, what would that look like to you? Would it substantiate your claim? Would it be clear and concise and in words that allow the reader to understand exactly what happened? And then that documentation translates over to coding. So while a lot of times we hear the conversations about our quality measures and our case mix and all this other stuff, in terms of coding is something we should always consider. Is it coded accurately? But I want you to start with the care. Did the care support a higher level of reimbursement? Did the care support a higher level of quality measure? Is the care appropriate? And so during our survey is going to view our care as being a skilled nature of a high level. Is it evidence-based? And then translating over the documentation, clear, concise. Is the coding reflect what's documented? Because we all know our charts are audited. They're going to look back at the documentation and see whether it's substantiated in their eyes, not ours, in theirs. So we have to look at it in that perspective. But I know I'm going to repeat myself, but it begins with care. Keep moving on. Sources. Now, there are resources and there are sources. Resources are people like me, Stacy, Megan, your consultants, the tools that you guys have come up with. Sources are so important to us, especially as we move into this process. We have a new RAI manual, or new version, updated version. We have to make sure that we're looking at the right version. And we have to make sure that we're looking and using the right MDS. So one of the things that I see year after year after year is a few people out there don't change their links or don't download. I like to personally download the link to the new MDS page at CMS, and I just go to that page and then open up the manual, open up the resources there, or the sources there. Make sure you've done that. Make sure that as you get closer to 10-1, that you ensure that your links are correct, that you're pulling up the right manual, that everything is in line for 10-1. Now after 10-1, for me, if I have something else downloaded, I'm either putting it in an archive file or I'm deleting it so I don't get confused, don't accidentally refer to it. The other piece that commonly happens in our field is we use cheat sheets. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of codes that we're dealing with. So there's a lot out there, and I understand that. So, well, I know everybody hates the term cheat sheets because we're not cheating on anything. So, it's that help tool that we use. Make sure that if you are using some type of cheat sheet, a list of tools, a list of codes, that you verify and validate that those codes are still appropriate as of 10/1/2023.
And Mark, I want to just say right here, a lot of your EMR systems, some of them haven't given the okay to open MDSs yet. Some of them have. Make sure that if you did open up MDSs prior to the okay from your EMR, that you go in and you change those, because it's going to have the wrong item set and it will get rejected and will not be allowed in the IQ system. So really make sure that if you are one of those that get into the habit of opening MDS 2 or 3 months in advance, make sure that it is the appropriate item set, because that entire item set changes for any ARD October 1 or after.
Excellent point. Excellent point. So let's keep moving through this. You guys know I could talk forever, but our goal with this call, with the whole process, is to make 10-1 as exciting as Y2K was for those of us who remember it. Y2K, what happened? Well, those of us who stayed up waiting for computers to fail, planes to fall out of the sky, satellites to not work, all those things not to work because of a glitch in the computer. What happened? Nothing. It was just another day. So I want your processes to be in place. I want them to be streamlined enough that it's just another day, that we can focus on care. We're not trying to change all our systems 10-1, that we've done the legwork, done the footwork to make sure that things are in place.
All right, so let's talk about interviews and look back periods. We've got some revisions and some new look back periods. So let's chat about that for just a minute. So quick reminder, this symbol, when you see this symbol in the REI manual or on your MDS, it's just going to simply mean that that section or that item requires a resident interview, increasing the resident's voice. All right, so lots of different look back periods in the MDS, as we know. It'll be vital to keep all of these straight. So section GG has, of course, that 3-day look back period, depending on what type of assessment you're working on. It'll either be the first 3 days of the stay, the last 3 days of the stay, or the ARD and the 2 prior days. But just keep in mind 3 days. That pain interview in section J, of course, still has that 5-day look back period. Catheters and ostomies in section H are a 7-day look back, while diagnoses in section I need to be actively monitored or treated in the last 7 days to be coded. Now, one exception to that is UTIs, which is that 30-day look back period. In the PHQ 2 to 9, we're asking about, those problems experienced over the last 2 weeks. In section K, we have items addressing that 5% weight loss or gain in the last 30 days, or 10% weight loss or gain in the last 180 days. And then in the new item at A 1250, we're going to be asking the resident if in the last 6 months to a year, lack of transportation has kept them from those medical appointments, meetings, work, or getting what they need for daily living. So that is a new item. But as you can see, lots of different look back periods here. So make sure you keep that REI manual handy and you know what time frame you're assessing. All right, so I want to point out a couple of differences in some of these interview items. So there is a difference in the resident being unable to respond to interview questions and the resident refusing to respond to the interview questions and how you proceed from there. So for example, if the resident is unable to respond, let's say to that ethnicity question in section A, the assessor can ask a family member, significant other, guardian, whoever, for a response. However, if the resident refuses to respond, you cannot code that item with any other resources. So there's a big difference in the coding instructions here, depending on the cause of that non-response.
I think one to point out too, like the social isolation, you can't use any other source,
Right.
whether they refuse or are unable. So the goal here, the to-do item, is just to become really familiar with which questions allow you to ask additional people or to look in the medical record as opposed to those that don't.
Yeah. So, and actually that's coming up here on the next slide. So we have some of those interview items that we just mentioned on this previous slide. We have ethnicity, and then also in section A, that transportation item. At B 1300, we have that health literacy item, which cannot be answered by anyone other than the resident. So if the resident is unable to respond here, can't ask anyone else, we would just code that 8 resident unable to respond. Then again, another new item at D 0700, that social isolation that you just mentioned, Stacy, which asks, how often do you feel lonely or isolated from those around you? Also, resident only interview item, can't ask anyone else if the resident declines or is unable to respond. All right, so we have our first mini to-do list here. So first things, communicate to the team what interviews are needing to be completed that day. Who's going to be responsible for gathering that information, and what happens if they're out of the facility on that particular day? Is there a backup assigned? Also, don't try to memorize everything. Print those interviews off, take them with you. This is one area where a cheat sheet, or what did Mark call them, a helper tool,
Yeah,
a help tool, would come in handy. So ask, we need to ask those questions that are lined out in the interviews, and just jot those responses down. Don't try to be superhuman and keep all of those questions in your brain. Identify the best person for the job. Assign those interviews to them. So use that Appendix D in the REI manual to train that person if they're not familiar with how to perform these interviews. There are some great tips on just how to interview to increase that resident voice and get the most information out of those interview questions. This is probably the biggest one to me. Follow up, right? Before everybody leaves for the day, make sure those assigned interviews were completed. They can't be used in the MDS if they're completed after the ARD. So those time frames for getting those interviews completed that's very important. Lots of implications there if we don't have a plan in place to follow up on those assignments at the end of the day. And then, of course, review those results as an IDT. Are the results what you expected? What needs to be followed up on from a care perspective? What resources do we need to utilize to ensure that the resident gets that best quality of care and the best outcomes possible?
So going back to one of the things you talked about right in the middle there is train and observe performance. It's one of the things that's concerned me in our industry. We have a really high level of confidence in the people that we hire. We often send them out to do things we haven't seen them do. And I think that's one of the mistakes that we make, is we don't go back and validate that they have that skill. Because not all nurses are created equal, trained equal, have equal experience. So that's one of the things, if I were to go out and implement something in the facility, I would want to, whether it's a social worker, a dietitian, a nurse, I would want to make sure that they're doing that skill, they're doing that interview assessment properly to ensure that they really can do it.
Yeah, for sure. Now, we separated out the PHQ 2 to 9 from the other interview items because this one is huge. It's a big change. It's something that we really want to focus on. So a couple of things that I want to say about the PHQ 2 through 9 is go to that Appendix D that Megan mentioned and read all of the interviewing techniques and things that they have listed in there. They're there for your help. The CMS also has on their website other tools and instructions. They have videos on how to do them. Go and use those sources that you have so that you're doing it the accurate way. I cannot tell you how many times over my career I have observed people do the PHQ 9 and it was done inaccurately, or how many times I've gone into a facility and they're like, well, I don't really ask all the questions because they get annoyed. So I just ask them if they're feeling okay. And if they say yes, then I just move on. And that totally defeats the purpose, right? So take this opportunity as an operator, as a DON, to say, okay, we're going to look at it again, see how we are performing these interviews and make sure that we're doing it the right way so that we're actually capturing what we should be. So in Appendix D, go ahead and go into the next slide. Or in the REI manual, it has those 2 gateway questions now, right? It used to be just the PHQ 9, we'd run through all of the questions. Now we have those 2 questions that we have to ask first to tell us if we need to continue on with the other questions. And those are little interest or pleasure in doing things, and then feeling down, depressed, or hopeless. So even when I'm reading these and I'm asking the resident, do you feel down, depressed, or hopeless? Sometimes we run those all together and the resident is just going to say no, right? So if we go into the next slide, we're going to talk about a couple of things that will help you get the most accurate information on these PHQs. So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to build that rapport with the residents. You're going to make sure that they know who you are. They feel comfortable talking to you. Oftentimes I see these done, the resident's laying in bed, the social worker goes into the room, they're in a hurry, they have 10 of these interviews that they have to get done today. They stand over the bed asking these residents very personal questions. And so the resident, of course, is going to pick up on that and just answer whatever they can to get the interview over as soon as possible. So really think about that report, slow down and take your time. You also want to talk about or think about the location that it's in. I always tell a story where we had a resident who shared a room with her BFF, and the only thing that divided their living space, right, was that shower curtain. And we went in to do this PHQ-9 with this resident, and we asked them if they were okay if we did the interview in their room. Their head was saying no, and their mouth was saying yes, it was okay. The social worker picked up on that and was able to say, okay, actually, I left something in my office. Let's go down there and we can talk along the way. So we helped the resident into her wheelchair, and we were wheeling down to the social worker's office, and we asked these questions and did the PHQ in the social worker's office. And what happened was that resident was having some issues and wanted to talk to somebody about it, but she knew that her best friend, who was her roommate, was also the biggest gossip of the building. And she knew that if she had talked openly to us, her roommate would have listened and would have spread that gossip around. And so she didn't want that to happen. So think about that when you're thinking about getting accurate information. Are you doing it in a location that they feel comfortable talking to you about these types of things, or admitting that these things are going on, or they're being bothered by these things? So location is huge. Remember, most of our residents are sharing a room with somebody else, and they don't necessarily want them to know all of their business. We're going to talk about some interviewing techniques that are listed in the REI manual. So these aren't things that we've just made up. These are things that are allowed per the guidance. And these techniques are found in Appendix D. So if we move on to the next slide, we're going to talk about the first technique, which is called unfolding. And these are actually techniques that can help you in your everyday conversation as well, but can be really beneficial in these resident interviews. So what you do with unfolding is you ask the general question about the symptoms, and then you follow it up by a sequence of more specific questions if the symptom is reported by the resident. And what it does is it's just walking the resident through the steps that they need to think through the question, because oftentimes it's just a lot all at once. So by unfolding that, you're making it easier for them. The next one, here's a couple of examples of unfolding, and these are right from the REI manual. So if you ask them about the symptom, you say, hey, do you have this at all? And if they say yes, then you can break it apart or unfold that and say, do you have it every day? And if they say no, you can ask, do you have it at least half of the days in the past 6 weeks, or the past 2 weeks, excuse me. So you can ask, you're unfolding those questions so that it's easier for them to think through it. So we're saying, do you have it every day? Do you have it at least half of the days? Do you have it some of the days? Okay. The next example that we have in the Appendix D, or the next technique that we have, is disentangling. And this is referring to separating items with several parts into manageable pieces. So very similar to unfolding. And what this does is it allows the resident to take a big giant list and disentangle it. Okay. And so the resident is given a chance to respond to each piece separately. So if we look at an example of that on the next slide, you're asking the question, poor appetite or overeating. So we're going to disentangle this, and we're going to ask them, do you have a poor appetite? And then you're going to pause and wait for them to respond to that. And whether they say yes or no, you're going to ask the next question, or overeating. So you're disentangling all of those pieces. So on those gateway questions, disentangling those, asking the first one where there's a comma, you're going to pause and then ask the next question. There's a comma, then you're going to pause and wait for them to respond to that piece as well. If neither part is rated positively, then you're going to code it as no. But if any of those pieces they say yes to, then you're going to code it as them having it, and you're going to move on to the next question. And that's really important to note. It doesn't say they have to have all of those symptoms. We're asking if they have any of those. So if they had one piece of it, we're going to mark it as yes. And this becomes a problem when we're just asking them all of these questions really quickly, or like in a robotic tone. They're just going to say no because they heard the first one you said and then they stopped listening, right? So this pause in between each response is going to be huge to make sure that we're getting the accurate information from that resident. The next technique is echoing. I think a lot of us use this technique in our daily life. And what you're doing is you're simply just restating part of the resident's response. And this can be really helpful in lots of different interviews that you're doing. And if the resident provides a related response, but does not use the provided responses, this is where you can restate what they've said using their own comment and relating it to what their responses can be. And then they agree with you. You then can move on and move forward. So it's echoing, repeating what they've said, but relating it to those responses that they have in that option. Now, those are the interview techniques that are explained in Appendix D, but then they talk about some other techniques as well. So repeat those response options for them. There's actually some cue cards that you can use that are on the CMS website as well that are available, which can be extremely helpful. Sometimes it's overwhelming, especially for this interview, the PHQ interview, because you're giving them lots of options for responses rather quickly. And so to be able to see those in writing can sometimes be helpful for them. You want to, if the resident is unable to answer the question, or they get really emotional with the question, it's okay for you to move on to another question. It's okay for you to stop and be a human and have comfort the resident and make sure that they have what they need. Don't get so robotic that you have to continue to push through that interview. You can break up the interview if they get tired, or they have to go to therapy, or they're going on an outing with your family. And with that, I would really say, make sure that you are scheduling them or going when you have time to do the interview. Not only you have the time, but the resident has the time. Oftentimes our interviews get miscoded or aren't accurate because we're rushing through them. We have to be at our kids' soccer game at 4:00. It's 3:15. I have to get all of these interviews done right now. So you're rushing through them. And I can guarantee you the residents feel that rush. And so they're going to say whatever they have to get you out of the room as quickly as they can. So it really goes back to that, building that rapport, making sure that you have time to do the interviews, making sure that they can hear you and that you are in an appropriate setting. Do not answer the questions for the resident and do not lead them. It talks a lot about this in the REI manual, making sure that it's their response. Now, you can ask clarifying questions and you can use those techniques that we just discussed, but you should never force a resident to say something or lead them. I often see social workers, they'll be doing their interviews for the PHQ, and as they're asking a question, they'll be shaking their head, or they'll say, "You haven't been feeling down, have you?" And that's leading the resident into what you want them to say. So you really want to avoid those and ask the questions exactly as they're written. It is a scripted interview, but again, you can go and use those techniques as well. So for our to-do list on our next slide, these are our actionable items. Make sure that you go and build that rapport with the residents. Now, you might be thinking, well, they've only been here for a day or two. How can I build that rapport? You would be surprised at how quickly you can build that relationship by going in, asking them questions about themselves, asking them questions about their family, their pets. Take cues on things that they have up in their room or things that they have on what to discuss with them. And everybody likes to talk about themselves. So that very quickly builds that trust and that rapport. Make sure that you have a quiet place to conduct these interviews. Make sure that it's a quiet, private place where they feel comfortable. If you don't know those techniques, if you've never heard of those techniques, or you just need a refresher, go to the Appendix D of the REI manual and reread those techniques. Make sure that you understand what they are and make sure that you understand how you can use them in your interviewing process. Again, do not rush the interviews. Take your time, slow down, and listen. Allow the resident to complete the interview in writing if they prefer. So if they prefer to have that in writing, allow them to do so. And there are instructions in the REI manual on how to conduct it in writing. If they need an interpreter, make sure that that interpreter is provided for them so that you can get the most accurate information. A lot of times, if a resident doesn't understand, they'll just shake their head or nod their head and pretend like they understood when they really didn't. So make sure that you're assessing for those interpreters and then providing them as needed.
So before we go to pay for performance, I just want to reiterate, there's a reason that we read those tips out of Appendix D to you. PHQ 2 to 9 is one of the areas that I think a lot of us have the most concern about, because in those facilities where we were identifying depression and symptoms of depression, that could go away if we don't take the time to do those two gateway questions correctly. We don't build that rapport, and that could financially impact your facility $30 to $50 a day in a lot of instances, which does not give us the resources that we need to care for these residents. So I want you to carefully consider that PHQ 2 to 9, how you're doing it, when you're doing it, where you're doing it, all those things that Stacy just talked about, because that is one of the areas that potentially could affect your facility quite dramatically on and after October 10th. So let's talk about pay for performance programs. When these started, and I'm one of those people that I like simple things. It would be nice if we had 1 or 2 or 3 performance measures, but each year we see additional measures given to us for our pay for performance measures from Medicare. The SNF quality reporting program is one of those programs that's developed and has grown dramatically over time. And so one of the things we haven't seen is a switch over in the way we're paid for that. Right now it's based on the DASH, and you can see that last bullet is that DASH threshold. And up until now, if we completed 100% of the required fields on 80% of our assessments that were sent into iKeys or sent into the Keys system, we were okay. We were okay. But behind the scenes, we have different measures that are continuing to be added. And you know, and I know that as CMS adds these measures, at some point there will be payment implications. And CMS has already given us timelines on some of them when they will be used. They haven't told us how they're going to be calculated. But I want you to be very conscientious of what's being added. Because it's just like any motor learning, a skill or a talent or anything that we practice. Unless we practice that skill, we don't get better at that skill. If we don't practice that movement, we don't get better at that movement. So think about those things in the runway that we're given right now as CMS. One of the first things, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later in this presentation, is that discharge function score. There are lots of things that are going to go into this. Like I said, we'll talk about it later, but the thing I want you to be most conscientious about is this affects a couple of your payment areas. And while CMS is going to be using this in the future, and they've given us a little time to get used to it and to get good at it, in my experience, if there's a measure like this, some of our other payers in the future may jump towards that and use it as well. They'll get on board with it. So right now it's the SNF QRP and the value-based purchase, but it's a big one because it could affect several different areas, or will affect several different areas of our payment, and could potentially affect more. Our COVID vaccination requirements are changing a bit. And it really is with the wording, and the wording means a lot in this case. So we're going from a different measure to now we have to be up to date with the current CDC recommendations. So CDC has over the past several years made a lot of adjustments in the recommendations. We're going to have to know what those recommendations are. And one of the things I always go back to is there's a lot of emotion tied up with the COVID vaccinations. There are even some very political type stances on the vaccinations. Here's the thing. Our intention, CMS's intention, is to protect the residents. So what do we need to do to protect the residents? And these measures are going to depend greatly on our education. How are we educating our residents and their families who help to make some of those decisions? How are we educating our healthcare professional and personnel? Do they understand why we're doing it and how we're doing it and what it means to our residents? Because we've seen the mortality rate and morbidity rate drop in our residents over the last several years. And a lot of the credit is going to having that active vaccination program. So educate, train. You might want to look at your infection preventionist. Is that the right person? Are they really promoting the vaccinations for the right reasons? The next is the transfer of health information. I like this one. One of the things that we've seen in the past and has affected some of our readmission rates and stuff like that, and the future success of our residents, allowing them to stay out in the community, is getting that updated medication list, getting the updated recommendations. Are we sending them out with the information they need to be successful? And is it clear and concise? Now, are we also sending that information out to their next physician or non-physician provider? Are we giving them the information they need? And one of the things that we know from experience is that when a resident goes from home to the hospital, their medications change. When they go from the hospital to the skilled nursing facility, often those medications change. And so by the time they go back home, what are they to do? Are they to go back to the original medications, which a lot of them will do without really clear information? This is a great way for us to send people home, give them the right information, make sure it's clear and concise, and make sure they know what not to do when they go home. The last bullet point on here is that dash that I mentioned before, and that 80% or 100% of the required fields on 80% of the MDSs is going from 80% to 90%. So 90% of those MDSs that we transmit have to have 100% of the required fields completed. And quite frankly, you don't want to be at that threshold. So if it's 90%, you should probably be at 96, 98%, because the dashes mean what? We know it means information that we don't have. So we don't want to leave fields blank if it's not required. And next. This is just a list of the 16 fields that are now part of the QRP program. So I just wanted you to have that so you can see we're measured on one item right now. Soon we'll likely be up to 16 measures. So really keep track, make sure you have processes in place for these. And next. SNP value-based purchase. Now, this again was one of those that right now we're measured on one thing. It's a rehospitalization. Pretty simple. So it's all-cause rehospitalization. But look at the list, it's growing. Now, as of 2020-28, there will actually be about 8 different measures, unless they change from year to year, but 8 things that we could be judged on. One is our nursing staff turnover, which is the same as on our 5-star. So pretty soon, we're going to be looking at that for a potential payment item as well. And we've got the discharge function measure mentioned on the SNF QRP. We'll mention it again in just a few minutes. We have long stay hospitalization per 1,000 resident days. So we're now seeing more and more long stay items add to the SNF QRP, having to do with treating in place mainly. Can we treat in place? And this is one of the things we need to look at our skill set. Can we treat in place? falls with major injury. It's also on our SNF QRP. It's on our 5-star. It affects us in so many ways. And we all know this is a huge event. It takes 270 days for it to fall off of our quality measures if we haven't had a new one. It's traumatic to our residents. Couple things, make sure that we're coding it correctly, that it really is a fall with what's categorized as a major injury, not just a serious injury. So follow the 4 criteria there. And then with our new hospitalization or rehospitalization, we're looking at potentially preventable readmissions. In my experience, we should be looking at any rehospitalization because we want to control as many of those as possible. The intention is not to stop sending people who need to go to the hospital. It really is to treat in place those conditions that could be treated in place safely. Next. So we're looking at our to-do list. We're going to review our current CASPER reports. Where are we right now? How do we score? What are we doing? How do we compare? Let's make sure. Let's own our weaknesses. If we're weak in an area, own it. Recognize it. Do something about it. Do not excuse it. Then we're going to focus on those items that affect both programs. And a couple of those that we mentioned, the long stay falls with major injury. Our functional outcome measure. And some of our rehospitalizations, they're on both lists. So preventable rehospitalizations will affect both SNF QRP and value-based purchase. Got to make sure that we're really focused on those. Identify your areas of weakness and engage and involve the entire clinical team. You know, a lot of times we'll see our MDS nurses put in charge of some of these things. That's a difficult task because a lot of these things, in fact, all of them, are clinically driven. So we need to have the entire team involved, understand. The team needs to know what we're working on. There's nothing more difficult than trying to change your metrics if very few people in the facility understand what you're working on. Now, the other thing is because some of these are ADL and mobility items, go observe your therapy department. Look to see if they're providing challenging evidence-based functional training. That means if I'm being measured on supine to sit and rolling in bed, am I practicing those things? If I'm measuring moving from the mat to a chair and back, I'm practicing those things. I'm practicing balance for gait. I'm making sure that we're doing those things that equate to mobility and function. It's not just the rainbow arc. It's not lightweight, real repetitive motion sitting in a wheelchair. It's challenging our residents. The other thing is make sure that those items that are weaknesses are in your QAPI program. Make sure that you're really moving the needle by improving your care and tracking that care and documenting that care. And next.
All right, so we are very briefly going to talk about the OSA, and actually we're just going to move straight to a to-do list. If you don't know if your state is going to require the OSA beginning on October 1st, please visit our website. We have an interactive map, every state in the United States and what their new Medicaid requirements are going to be for payment. So please, if you don't know that answer, you need to know before October 1st. Just visit that map so you can take a look and see what your individual states are doing. But if you are in a state that is going to require the OSA, make sure first that you download that updated OSA manual. So that OSA manual is only going to contain the coding instructions for the items that are not in the regular MDS OBRA item set. So you're probably going to have to keep both pulled up on your computer for a while and be referencing both of those. It is the OSA user's manual is very condensed. And like I said, it's only going to contain those instructions for those actual OSA specific items. Know which items that you're working on. The item sets are while they contain questions that we're used to in the MDS, the things like the PHQ-9 and Section G could get very confusing if you're not really compartmentalizing what you're doing and what you're working on. especially section G versus section GG, we're going to have to code those 4 late loss ADLs on the OSA. So using that rule of 3 could become pretty confusing if you're, used to, at this point, moving forward with usual performance in section GG. So, so a couple of tips for the OSA there. And speaking of section G and section GG, we're going to talk about that for just a couple of minutes. So first, I want to look at the coding options for the GG items, because we really need staff to understand this first in order to get that accurate documentation. So this should be familiar, but as a refresher, let's go through each of these. So as you'll notice, the scale is inverse from what we're used to in the old section G. The higher the number, the more independent the coding option. So 06 is going to be independent, meaning that that resident completes the activity completely by themselves, no assistance from a helper. 05, setup or cleanup assistance. The helper assists only prior to or following the activity, but not during that activity. So for example, we're talking about cutting up food, opening containers, setting up assistive devices for the resident, things like that. 04, supervision or touching assistance. So this code is used for residents who need a helper to provide verbal cues or touching, steadying, contact guard assistance, either intermittently throughout that activity or throughout the entire activity. It was also, just to note, it was also clarified in the new RAI manual to use this 04 code if the resident requires only verbal cueing to complete that activity safely. 03, partial moderate assistance. This code is to be used if the helper does less than half the effort. And that means helper is like lifting, holding, supporting trunk or limbs, but again, providing less than half the effort. 02, substantial or max assist. This is going to be coded when the helper provides more than half the effort. And then 01, dependent, coded when that resident does none of the effort to complete the activity, or when we have the assistance of 2 or more helpers required to complete that activity. And section G, as we know, was removed from that new MDS item set. However, there are a few few MDS items that were moved over to section GG. So as we go through the next couple of slides, just keep in mind that while section G is gone, you'll still have to have documentation to support these items that moved over. And here again, you can see those coding options for the old section G that are inverse from GG. So the higher the number, the more dependent the coding here. All right, so one of those items that moved over was G0400, and it moved to GG0115. The scale here should be familiar. This is an item that we've been coding for a long time. It's either no impairment, impairment on one side, or impairment on both sides, looking at both the upper and lower extremities. So again, coding instructions should be familiar. It's just that now when you go to that REI manual, these coding instructions and tips are going to be under section GG versus section G. It's not going to be in the manual anymore. All right, another item that moved over is GG0120 mobility devices. We still have the same 7-day look back period here, and we're looking for the types of mobility devices that the resident normally uses for locomotion, both in the room and around the facility. This is a check-all that applies, so all of the devices that were normally used by the resident would be coded. Again, should be familiar. We've been coding this one for quite some time. All right, another one here, personal hygiene. This is now going to be located at GG0130I, but there is a notable difference that I want to talk about in this item, and that's the exclusion of oral hygiene. So when this item was in section G, it included brushing teeth, and that is no longer the case. So we're only going to be looking at maintaining personal hygiene as it relates to combing hair, shaving, putting on makeup, washing and drying the face and the hands. We are not going to consider how the resident bathes, takes a shower, or performs oral hygiene with this item. Those are going to be split off into 2 separate items in this new MDS set. We're going to take a look at that here. So in the soon-to-be old MDS item set in a couple of days, bathing and transfers into or out of the tub and shower were combined into one item at G0120. Again, now split into 2 different items, with showering or bathing at GG0130E and tub or shower transfers at GG 0170FF. That's a lot of letters and numbers. These items now follow the assessment and coding instructions that go along with section GG. All right, so to-do list for section GG, decide who is going to be documenting specific to section GG and train them on these scales that we just went over. The importance of this documentation also needs to be conveyed to the staff that's going to be responsible for documenting on these, and also where are they going to be documenting this information. Can also consider the quantity of the documentation needed to identify the resident's usual performance. It's going to be very difficult to make these coding decisions on the MDS with very little documentation or not enough input from the staff. So here, more is better. Designate a GG champion, right? So identify someone on the nursing or rehab team to review all that documentation, to interview the residents and the family and the staff and huddle with the IDT to determine that usual performance. Make sure that when that determination of usual performance is made and decided, that documentation gets into the EMR. We need that located somewhere in the EMR, that final coding decision to match what's on the MDS to hold up in a medical review situation. So whether that's a UDA, a progress note, or even on paper, we still see a lot of people making that decision, putting it on paper. Just make sure that gets uploaded and into the EMR. And then finally, just kind of revisiting that OSA situation. If you are in a state that's going to use that OSA, you're still going to need that documentation to support those 4 late loss IDL items. So from an MDS workflow perspective, you'll need to really pay very close attention to how you gather that documentation for coding the OSA and really kind of compartmentalize those processes so you're not confusing yourself in, am I using the rule of 3? Am I gathering usual performance and using those coding scales? You'll definitely want to keep those 2 processes very separate in your mind and in your day-to-day workflow.
So we're going to jump into the new functional outcome score. There are a lot of items in section GG. As Megan has talked about, a lot of those items that were in G have now been broken apart, and one item in G could now cover 3 or 4 items in section GG. But these are the ones that you need to pay attention to for this new functional outcome measure. You've got eating, oral hygiene, toilet hygiene, roll left to right, lying to sitting, sit to stand, chair to bed to chair transfer, toilet transfer, walk 10 feet, walk 50 feet with 2 turns, and wheel 50 feet with 2 turns. Those should look familiar to you because those are the same GG items that are used in our PDPM as well. So focusing on these specific GG items for the new functional outcome measure. So why do we care about this new functional outcome measure? As Mark already talked about, it's going to impact our SNF QRP as well as our SNF value-based purchasing, which are both tied to money for our residents or our reimbursement at our facility. But not only that, most of the time when Medicare makes a change or Medicare puts a new program into place, it doesn't take long for other payers to soon follow that. So we're going to see a lot of our ACOs, our bundle payments, and other managed care payers, they're going to be using these function score outcome as well and looking, do we really want to send our clients to these facilities if they're not improving in function? If their residents are not improving in function, do we really want to participate with them in these programs? Because we're really looking for those improved outcomes and that improved success at home. And these are the items that they've chosen to help determine that. So it's going to impact so many parts of our business, not to mention just our community seeing us as not making people go better. We're making them worse by coming to our facility. So we don't want them to come to our facility because they're not getting better. So to-do list for these functional outcome, you want to make sure that you're setting those correct baseline measurements. This was a huge thing that I've seen throughout my career. Our staff members get so used to that just charting whatever. They're just trying to get rid of all of the reds, and they're not really paying attention to what they're documenting. So we're setting our baseline measures higher than what the usual performance actually was. And what that does is then when they're performing and we're accurately documenting at the end of their stay, it looks like they didn't make improvements, but we know that they did, but our documentation doesn't show that. Our coding on the MDS doesn't show that. So really making sure that during that look back period, whether it's the first 3 days of the stay, making, or if it's whatever your window is, making sure that you are accurately assessing that usual performance for these GG items, and we're setting correct baseline measurements so that we know what we're going off of. And then focus care on those specific areas that we've talked about, making sure that those are in place, because we've determined, or CMS has determined, that those are good indicators that the resident needs to be able to do to succeed at home or the next level of care. And then set your correct discharge levels and make sure that you go back and review the GG to-do list that Megan just talked about, which includes picking that GG champion, making sure that your staff is accurately documenting, and then we have those usual performances documented in the medical record.
Okay, let's keep going. Next slide. Gonna wrap it up. One of my favorite things is who does what by when. I think that's how we get things done. That's by giving out specific assignments. And think about your morning meetings and your weekly meetings. Are they really laser focused? Do people know what to do? Are we having effective stand down meetings so that those things in the morning that were assigned are completed before people go home? We know that a lot of what we assign is time sensitive. Got to have it done. Got to have it done today. And does everyone know what to do, especially as they attend meetings? What am I responsible for? How do I prepare? How do I come to that meeting and present the proper information? And do people come prepared? One of the things I always wonder is who's responsible to make sure team members come prepared. Generally, it's the administrator. Please don't assign and delegate everything out. Administrators, take responsibility, make sure that your team are coming prepared. They're doing what they need to do to make your meetings meaningful. Next slide. That to-do list wrap up. Download user right information sources. Stacy probably gave the best advice of the whole presentation, saying make sure that you talk to your EMR and they're using the proper MDS. You have the proper MDS open. That's the first place we start. So make sure our sources, our MDSs are correct. The second thing is make specific assignments. We know a lot of things are changing. So who is responsible to do what? Megan brought up having a backup. If you have one person responsible, but there's no backup, that's not a process. That's one person. Make sure you have a process. Make sure your teams are prepared and can accurately complete the assessments we give to them. Observe, teach, train, observe, go back. And then make sure our baseline measurements are accurate. Then take a deep breath, move forward with confidence if you're doing these things. And then after 10-1, regroup, reassess what you're doing, reset your strategy. Make sure your team understands that 10-1 is not Y2K. The end of the world is not 10-1. We can go back and fix things if you're using the right MDS, if your assessment reference dates are set and your assessments are open, you're okay, but we can get better from week to week. So the next slide, we really appreciate you joining us. Send your questions in to us. We will respond to them. The next slide, just to remind you, QRM, we are a full service oversight. We understand CMIs, we understand reimbursement, whether it's from PDPM or other sources, quality measures, 5-star, RAI. Then the very last slide, it's how you get a hold of us. If you need anything, let us know. Lots of resources out there for you. We're happy to help you. So thank you for joining us today. Have a great week. Let's finish out this year strong, this fiscal year. Be ready for 10-1. So Stacy and Megan, thank you for joining me today and participating. You did a great job, and hopefully people listening will reach out if they have any questions. Back
Thanks.
to you, Amy.
Well, I couldn't have said it better, Mark. And again, thank you, Mark, Stacy, and Megan. You guys did a phenomenal job. So until we meet again, take care, everyone, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.